All right, let's talk about parameters influencing classical conditioning. So what makes a good conditioned stimulus? Are all conditioned stimuli the same? Well, one is that the conditioned stimulus needs to have a sufficient amount of salience, meaning that it needs to be strong enough for the individual to perceive, right? So you could have a conditioned stimulus, in theory that, right, could just be just the movement of my fingers or of air, right? Something that would not be easily detectable or relatively noticed. So that we would consider salient. So something that is more salient, like yes versus yes, are going to be different in terms of salient. So more salient, something that is more easily detectable is going to be a better CS, but also something that's going to be more novel. So for example, imagine if in your daily lifetime you say, oh, that's great. Oh, that's good. I enjoyed this. Good. That is good. This is good. That is good. Right? And your dog is hearing good all of the time. If it's something that is happening a lot of the times that is not predictive of anything, then it's going to be a typically familiar type of thing or a familiar type of word. It's not going to be as novel. So what typically makes a better CS is something that is novel. It doesn't just occur by chance alone very frequently, such that when this really salient and rare and novel thing appears, like I've never heard of this sound in my life before, it's very loud, and it doesn't frequently occur, then that typically tends to be one of your better CSs. So something that is going to be brand new, novel, interesting. So when you think about a particular type of odor, something that's going to be salient, so something that's going to be detectable, something that they don't encounter very frequently in their environment, and something that is going to be novel, so they haven't had a lot of experience with it before, are all going to be really good features that will make a particular type of odor a good conditioned stimulus. Not that you can't get conditioning for things that aren't novel or aren't rare or aren't salient, but these will typically just lead to faster reaching of that asymptotic level of conditioned responding. In addition, contingency and contiguity are going to be important. So what I mean by contingency is, if the CS appears, what is the probability that the US will appear? And what is the probability that the CS would have appeared if the US appears? So if you have very tight contingency, meaning that the US really only appears when the CS comes first, and that the CS only comes when the US is going to come next, that tends to produce better conditioning, as well as contiguity, meaning that they occur in similar periods of time, so that you don't have a CS occurring yesterday and your US occurring tomorrow, that they occur in relatively similar periods of time. There's going to be a lot of variation within this a little bit, and there's a lot of models out there that help predict some of the phenomena that occur. There's actually a wide variety of different types of phenomena that occur, like latent inhibition, blocking, that we won't really get into or dive too much into this particular series of lessons, just because of it's complicated. But if you're feeling more advanced, I highly recommend you to read more about the Rescorla-Wagner model, as well as the various other types of models of classical conditioning out there. So going back to timing as being an important feature, one of the things that's important, again, is whether the CS has any type of, let's say, predictive power, meaning that does it actually give you or yield any type of information? So we could have our CS and US occurring, so our metronome or our yes or whatever that happens to be, where the CS and US occur at the exact same time. So this is like, yes, food going straight to the mouth at the exact same time. This would be an example of simultaneous conditioning. We could have what we call delay conditioning, where CS onsets a few seconds prior to the US, but overlapped with it. So that would be like, yes, as food is going into the mouth. We can have trace, where there's a gap in time, where it's yes, when Mississippi, then the US is delivered. We can have backwards, which is what we probably do sometimes by accident, which is, here is the food, and then say yes. Do any of these procedures sort of compare, or how do these different procedures compare in terms of their effectiveness and producing a bigger and stronger conditioned response? And there's actually some debate as to what degree, more conditioned responding is actually related to more conditioning. But in this case, we'll just talk about more condition responding that is observed. Typically, delay conditioning will lead to the most condition responding, followed by trace, then simultaneous, and backwards. So here, delay has both close contiguity, meaning that it is close in time, as well as contingency. If the CS appears, then the US comes. So it has some type of predictive power. Trace is going to have similar types of contingency, but it's going to differ a little bit in terms of contiguity. There's going to be a gap in time before the CS appearing in the US. Simultaneous, on the other hand, are going to be very close in time together. We have similar contiguity, but we start to lose a little bit of the predictive power. In other words, the CS isn't helping us prepare for anything because it's happening at the same time as the US. So if you're going to pay attention to something, then why not just pay attention to the unconditioned stimulus? Because the CS here is not really leading to more information about what is going to happen because you detect the US and CS at the exact same time. And then backwards, you have similar overlaps of time, but you're not getting any type of predictive power here because the US is actually coming first, then the CS comes. So the CS isn't telling you anything because the US has already come. It's telling you that the US has already come. So in this case, typically we'll get little to no levels of conditioning. So delay leads to the most. We get intermediate condition responses with trace and simultaneous, and typically least, it has been demonstrated before, so least to sort of no type of levels of conditioning. So what does this mean? One of the first types of research projects that I looked at actually was, well, what does this type of pairing or odor pairing mean for a common procedure of sort of rewarding at source? So what we did is a little study, I guess back in 2013 now, where we had a simple discrimination task where the dogs were trying to come up and dig around in the bucket of pine shavings that had their target odor in it. And we looked at a couple of different ways of doing it. One is that once the dog began to dig around, we immediately delivered the reinforcer by hand, or experimenter delivered the reinforcer by hand. We had the other option in which food was actually buried right with the target odor in this T-ball, such that there was this T-ball with open food. They start digging around, they come across the T-ball with the food, they can immediately eat the food sitting right there on top of the odor. And then we had a control of just another bucket of just food and presence there. So this is an example of the dog digging around to reveal an odor pad that had the target odor of interest. We basically looked at, well, which of these procedures led to sort of the fastest acquisition. And what we found here is that the dogs that had the experimenter delivered food for the odor detection task, which is the line, I get the laser pointer up for you real quick. This line right here learned the task the fastest. So this is after the dog started digging, we then delivered the food by hand towards the dog versus having the food and odor buried together, which is going to be the triangles here that bounced around a little bit. We also compared this to a visual task. So what if we did the same kind of task, but the dog could actually make a choice by looking at the different colors of the bins whatsoever. So was it the same color or different? And what we found here is that this is the dogs that had the experimenter delivered food versus the dogs that had the visual food buried, sort of overlapped quite a bit. So generally, the dogs tended to perform better when the US, or the unconditioned stimulus, came immediately after sort of the appearance or presentation, in this case, of the conditioned stimulus, which was our odor source here, versus having them appearing sort of simultaneously, or physical presence in the same location. There are a couple of important caveats necessary to this interpretation, because one is there's a sort of conflation here between physical presence together and actual sort of odor appearance, right? So here we had different foods, so perhaps the smell of the food might have actually come before the appearance of the odor itself, or if the odor itself appeared first, then we can still have conditioning that is occurring where the odor, CS, appears first, followed by the food, or perhaps there was distraction based off of the food being buried in the non-target container. But nonetheless, despite all of these different kinds of interactions, we do know from a variety of different studies that it's important that to get higher levels of conditioning or condition responding, you do want that CS to appear first rather than at the same time as the US or coming potentially after the US appearing. So another question that I think comes up is, well, how is the CS being perceived by the dog? So a lot of times is the CS and the US coming to substitute for one another. So what I mean by that is, say, for example, you're using toy as your unconditioned stimulus that leads to play as your unconditioned response, some type of toy, or even necessarily whether you're using food. And you're using an odor, your target odor that you are associating with that US. Is the dog coming to view this odor as being equivalent as food? Are they making an association that the target odor equals food, or that the target odor equals toy, that they're one and the same? So does a dog see or perceive the CS to be the same as the US, or a substitution? Does the dog smell the odor and view it as prey or toy when it is being conditioned with odor as a particular CS? And the answer is probably not. Generally speaking, any types of theories that seem to try to substitute that the animal is coming to replace the CS as being equal to the US or as the same as the US do not work out very well. So what we mean by that is, if you're putting your target odor in with this particular toy, the dog is not coming to see that this target odor equals toy or is a replacement for toy. It remains that the CS comes to be a predictor of toy rather than becoming the same as. So the CS does not substitute for the US. The CS does not become viewed as the US, but rather the CS tells the animal that the US, or the unconditioned stimulus, the toy or the food, is coming. And what the conditioned stimulus does is it activates preparatory behavior for that US. So one of the things that you might see is when the dog comes into an odor that's been associated with either food or a toy, you will start to see different types of responses that are coming as preparation for that terminal, that reinforcer, that food or that toy, but they are not viewing that that target odor means that that is the toy, is not coming to substitute. And a cute little example of this was done in a study by Wasserman with chicks, or little chickens, that had two different stimuli here. So there was a red key light that would turn on, which would then be paired with a heat lamp. So little chicks like little warmth. So there would be this red little light here that would appear. A few seconds later, the heat lamp would turn on. And what they found is that after repeated situations or repeated trials, you get two different responses. So the unconditioned response is this kind of flapping your wings out to absorb the heat. So this kind of, I'm getting the heat from the heat lamp. So that is your unconditioned response when you are presented with the unconditioned stimulus of the heat lamp. However, towards the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response that they developed was what was called this kind of snuggling response. They kind of rub up against it. So a very different response. They were not treating the red key light like it was a heat lamp, meaning that they were going up and turning to the red key light to be like, oh, I'm going to get warm from this red key light, but it was becoming the same. They engaged in a different response, like this kind of snuggling response that was preparatory or activated similar biological systems related to the heat lamp, but they were not viewing that key light as the heat lamp. So, and this is the same case, is that you're not viewing the odor as the toy or the food, but rather that it is coming as a predictor or preparatory to those stimuli coming. Okay, so we'll take another break here and we'll discuss physiological conditioning next.